Pat Boone, the golden boy of American pop, was once seen as the perfect contrast to Elvis Presley. Where Boone was clean-cut and holy, Elvis was wild and dangerous. At least, that's how the world saw it. But now, at 91, Boone is finally lifting the curtain on a truth he's carried for over 6 decades. A truth about a man the world called the King, and the moment that changed everything between them. Beneath the flashing lights, there was tension, secrets, and a bond no one ever truly saw. Boone's confession doesn't just rewrite Elvis's legacy. It tears open a part of music history no one dared touch. Because what Pat Boone is about to admit isn't just shocking, it's personal. And it may be the one thing Elvis never wanted anyone to know. In the early 1950s, the music world was standing on a fault line, right before it cracked open and changed forever. On one side was Pat Boone, a preacher's son from Nashville with a clean image, college degree, and a voice built for radio. On the other was Elvis Presley, a truck driver from Tupelo with slick hair, restless hips, and a raw sound no one could quite define. They were born just 13 months apart, raised on gospel and southern heat, and though their paths seemed opposite, their beginnings weren't so different. Boone had started performing in talent shows while still in high school, marrying his sweetheart Shirley at 19, and staying rooted in faith. By 1955, he had already landed a record deal and was charting hits, often covering black artists' songs and smoothing them out for white audiences. Elvis, meanwhile, had just recorded That's All Right at Sun Studio, igniting a sound that scared parents and electrified teenagers. Where Boone was seen as safe, Elvis was chaos. And yet, they were both chasing the same dream, to break through. What most people don't know is that they didn't view each other as enemies, not at first. In fact, Boone was one of the first major artists to publicly defend Elvis. While TV pundits and pastors warned of Presley's gyrations and rebellious image, Boone said, "There's more to him than people think. He's got talent. He's got soul." The two met for the first time backstage at a Louisiana hayride event. Boone, polished in a suit, Elvis in a barely buttoned shirt and slouched stance. "You're Pat Boone," Elvis said with a grin, "and you're gonna take all my gigs." Boone replied. They laughed, but the air between them was thick with quiet recognition. Each saw the other as both threat and mirror. Though they never toured together, their careers ran neck and neck for years. In 1956, Boone's hit I Almost Lost My Mind topped the charts just as Elvis was releasing Heartbreak Hotel. Radio DJs couldn't go an hour without spinning one or the other. But while Boone was invited into living rooms, Elvis was often kept at arm's length, censored, warned against, feared. And here lies the great divide that would eventually fracture their bond. Boone fit the mold of what 1950s America wanted to believe about success, that virtue would be rewarded. Elvis, on the other hand, embodied the hunger that couldn't be boxed in. He was the storm, rising fast, burning bright, and always on the edge of losing control. Still, behind the curtain, Boone noticed something else. Elvis wasn't trying to cause trouble, he once said in a rare 1987 interview. He just didn't know how to stop what he'd started. The fame, the hysteria. It wasn't a strategy. It was a wave he was riding with no idea where it would crash. Boone, ever the observer, kept a distance, but never stopped watching. He reminded me of a gospel singer in the wrong revival tent. Boone would later write in his private journal, surrounded by sinners, preaching something holy, but always tempted by the spotlight. They were two sides of the same American coin, faith and fire, structure and rebellion. And in that fragile balance, something had to give. Boone didn't know it then, but their friendship would be tested not by the music, but by something much deeper, something that neither of them could outrun. It was January 28th, 1956, when Pat Boone and Elvis Presley were both booked for a major national TV appearance, the kind that could make or break a career. Boone was already a household name, the darling of Middle America. Elvis, on the other hand, was still a rising force, but the buzz around him was becoming impossible to ignore. The show was the Dorsey Brothers Stage Show, and behind the cameras, tensions simmered. Boone arrived hours early, rehearsed, prayed quietly in his dressing room. Elvis showed up late, with a swagger, his entourage in tow. But Boone noticed something strange. He wasn't nervous, Boone recalled decades later. He looked like he'd seen something, like he was walking into battle. Boone approached him backstage, offering a simple, "You ready for this?" Elvis paused, stared into the distance, then muttered, "It's already bigger than me." That line stuck with Boone for the rest of his life. The performance that night would go down in history, not because of Boone's polished delivery, but because of Elvis's wild, magnetic energy. Viewers across the country were shocked, thrilled, scandalized. The backlash came quick. Churches condemned him. Newspapers called him vulgar. Boone's segment faded into the background. Elvis, for better or worse, became the main event. That night marked a turning point, not just in music history, but in Boone's understanding of who Elvis really was. It wasn't just about shaking hips or stealing spotlights. Boone began to realize that Elvis was carrying something far heavier than fame. After the show, Boone found Elvis sitting alone in a hallway, staring at the floor. Boone sat next to him, and for a moment, neither said a word. Finally, Elvis whispered, "I don't know what." "I've started," Boone said. "You've started something people can't stop." Elvis shook his head. "I don't think I can stop it either." Boone would later describe that moment as a confession, a subtle cry for help. It wasn't the words, it was the look in Elvis's eyes, a look that said he felt more like a prisoner than a king. Boone tried to offer comfort, but the wall between them had begun to rise. Elvis was headed somewhere Boone couldn't follow. That night planted the seed of something deeper in Boone's mind, a responsibility he would carry in silence for years. Because when he saw Elvis perform under the hot stage lights, when he heard the screams and saw the chaos unfold, he realized the machine was already moving too fast. Boone had escaped that kind of spotlight by staying safe, staying clean. Elvis had surrendered to it, and Boone couldn't shake the feeling that one of them had made a deal, and the other would live to regret it. As the 1960s began, the contrast between Pat Boone and Elvis Presley grew starker. Boone continued to ride a wave of steady success, hosting his own TV show, raising a family with Shirley, and recording gospel albums that comforted the American heartland. Meanwhile, Elvis was unraveling under the weight of his own legend. Boone watched from a distance as the boy he once spoke with in quiet corners of backstage halls transformed into a global spectacle. The Vegas lights, the pills, the press. Behind closed doors, Boone often defended Elvis to ministers and critics who labeled him dangerous. "You don't know him like I do," Boone would say. "He's not evil, he's exhausted." Boone had seen it during a private visit to Graceland in 1962. The mansion was beautiful, but cold. Elvis greeted him warmly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You ever feel like you're singing to a wall?" Elvis asked him. Boone said yes, but what Elvis meant was different. "This place," Elvis said, waving toward the chandeliers and velvet curtains, "feels more like a cage every day." Boone remembered sitting across from him in that living room, watching as the king of rock and roll confessed his confusion. "I still pray," Elvis said. "I still believe." But Boone saw the signs, the painkillers on the table, the hollow laugh. Elvis wasn't lost. He was drifting, and the world was too busy watching the show to notice the man was sinking. Boone tried to steer the conversation toward scripture. He brought up the story of David, the flawed king with a heart for God. Elvis nodded, but there was a distance in his gaze. "Sometimes I think I'm Goliath," Elvis said, "not David." Boone left Graceland that night with a strange weight on his chest. He didn't talk about it to the press. He didn't share it with friends. But in his journal he wrote, "Elvis is looking for a way out, but I don't think he knows where the door is." Boone's own life stayed anchored. He had boundaries, rules, a spiritual routine. Elvis had none of that. He was surrounded by people who said yes to everything, who kept the party going no matter how tired he was. Boone believed fame without faith was a fire too hot to handle. And watching Elvis stumble through that heat, still trying to find something real, broke his heart. They weren't enemies. They were echoes, two voices from the same place, singing into very different storms. But Boone could see what was coming. And the fall, when it came, would not be sudden. It would be slow, quiet, and devastating. By the late 1960s, the world had changed, and so had Elvis Presley. The fame had not faded, but something inside him had. The '68 comeback special was supposed to be a triumphant return, a resurrection of the raw Elvis that once shocked the world. And it was. But few knew what happened behind the curtain. Pat Boone wasn't in the audience that night. He was in a hotel room across town when he got the call. It wasn't from Elvis. It was from someone close to him. Someone Boone had met years earlier during a gospel benefit. "He wants to see you," the voice said. No details, no press, just quiet urgency. Boone drove to the location, an unmarked room at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. The hallway was dim, security was light, and when Boone entered, he found Elvis alone, slouched in a chair, robe draped over his frame, eyes heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. The room smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and cologne. There was no music playing, just silence. Boone sat down across from him. "You look tired," he said. Elvis nodded. "I'm tired of trying to be Elvis," he whispered. What followed was one of the most honest conversations of Boone's life. Elvis confessed he felt disconnected from everything. His music, his fans, even God. "They want the myth," he said, "but the man, nobody wants the man." Boone tried to reach him. He reminded Elvis of their roots, of the hymns they both grew up singing, of the power that came from faith. Elvis listened. He cried. And then he asked Boone a question that would stay with him forever. "If one of us makes it out, promise me you'll tell the truth, the real story." Boone hesitated. He knew what Elvis was asking, not just to remember him fondly, but to reveal the struggle behind the spotlight, to speak of the soul behind the star. "If one of us makes it out," Boone replied, "we tell the truth." There was no handshake, no ceremony, just that sentence hanging in the air like a prayer, a pact sealed in pain. Boone left the room with a knot in his stomach. He wanted to believe Elvis would turn things around, that this moment would mark a turning point. But deep down, he feared it was already too late. The industry didn't want to save Elvis. They wanted to use him until there was nothing left. Boone kept that meeting a secret for decades. He never spoke about it publicly, not even when Elvis died. But it haunted him, because a vow like that doesn't fade, it waits. And now, at 91, Boone says he's finally ready to keep his promise, to break the silence, and to tell the truth. When Elvis Presley died in August 1977, the world stopped. News anchors broke down on camera. Fans collapsed in tears outside Graceland. Candlelight vigils stretched across continents. But one voice stayed curiously quiet, Pat Boone's. While tributes flooded the airwaves, Boone made only a brief, carefully worded statement. No talk shows, no tearful interviews, just a few lines about loss and legacy. People assumed Boone had moved on, but the truth was far more complicated. Behind the scenes, Boone was devastated, not just by the death, but by what it meant. He hadn't kept the pact. He hadn't warned the world. He hadn't said what he should have said when it might have made a difference. "I mourned in silence," Boone later wrote in a journal entry, "because my grief wasn't just for Elvis, it was for my own failure." Boone had watched for years as the music industry commodified his friend's pain. The pills, the pressure, the people who pushed Elvis deeper into addiction while smiling on stage. Boone saw the same producers who once mocked Elvis now profiting off his funeral. It made him sick, but still, he said nothing. Why? Because guilt is a quiet jailer. Boone felt that speaking out after Elvis's death would be seen as opportunistic, so he buried the truth. He kept doing shows, singing gospel, raising his daughters, leading prayer meetings. But late at night, when the crowds were gone, he'd sometimes play an old Presley gospel album and sit alone with his thoughts. He was searching. Boone once told a close friend he never stopped searching, and we all watched him drown. Boone's wife Shirley noticed the shift. "You don't smile the same anymore," she told him once. Boone shrugged it off, but inside, the regret gnawed at him. He had once promised Elvis he would speak the truth if he made it out. Now, Elvis was gone, and Boone felt like a man standing alone with a secret that was never meant to be his. Over the years, he was asked dozens of times to talk about Presley. He always gave the safe answer. He was talented, he changed music, but he never shared what mattered. He never told them what Elvis said that night in Vegas. He never admitted the depth of his own sorrow. Until recently. In 2024, at a private Christian conference, Boone finally opened up. Surrounded by pastors and believers, he said something he had held in for nearly 50 years. I let him down. The room fell silent. He asked me to tell the truth, Boone continued, and I didn't. Not when it counted. It wasn't a headline. It didn't trend, but it was real. And in that moment, Pat Boone began to unlock the cage he'd built inside himself, because sometimes the hardest truth to tell is the one that lives in your own. Reflection. It was supposed to stay hidden, a small, leather-bound journal tucked inside a box of forgotten memorabilia, gathering dust in the corner of Pat Boone's attic. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't dated, but inside were words that no one, not even Boone's children, knew he'd written. In early 2023, while helping him sort through decades of keepsakes, Boone's daughter Lindy found it. At first, she thought it was a tour log or lyric notebook, but then she saw the name Elvis scribbled on the first page. And what followed wasn't a tribute. It was a confession. Dozens of handwritten entries, some stretching all the way back to 1957, chronicled Boone's personal thoughts, fears, and heartbreak over the man he once called a brother in the spotlight. The entries weren't organized. Some were brief, just a few lines. Others were pages long, filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. "He's not going to make it," one early entry read, "not unless someone steps in." Another, written just months before Elvis's death, simply said, "I feel like I failed him again." Boone confirmed the journal's authenticity after his daughter confronted him. He hadn't intended for anyone to read it, not until he was gone. But after rereading his own words, he agreed it was time to tell the world what he saw, not as a fellow celebrity, but as a witness to a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. The journal painted a different picture of Elvis than the tabloids ever did. Not the sex symbol, not the addict, not the rock god, but a man constantly torn between two worlds, fame and faith. He wanted peace, Boone wrote in one entry, but every time he got close to it, someone sold him another dream. The entries revealed the depth of Boone's internal struggle. He admired Elvis's talent, envied his reach, but feared his fall. He wanted to help, but didn't know how, and every time he stayed silent, it ate away at him. "I wonder if I could have changed it," he wrote. One conversation, one warning. Would it have mattered? One of the final entries in the journal struck the deepest chord. Dated the night of Elvis's funeral, Boone had written by candlelight, "I hope he knew I loved him. I hope heaven is louder than Vegas. I hope he finally found the quiet." Boone's daughter encouraged him to share the journal publicly. He hesitated, afraid it would be seen as exploitation. But then he remembered the promise, the pact, and with a trembling voice, he told a room full of young songwriters, "This was my truth, and now it's yours, too." The last time Pat Boone saw Elvis Presley alive wasn't at a party or an award show. It was in a dressing room behind the glittering chaos of Las Vegas. It was 1976, and Elvis was in the middle of a grueling tour schedule that kept him locked in a cycle of late-night performances, sleepless mornings, and a pharmacy's worth of medication just to stay upright. Boone had come to town for a charity event. He hadn't planned to see Elvis, but a last-minute invitation from one of Elvis's longtime band members changed that. "He's not doing well," the voice said. "Maybe seeing you will help." Boone walked into the dressing room that night and barely recognized the man sitting in front of the mirror. Elvis was bloated, sweating through his jumpsuit, eyeliner smeared from the heat, a paper cup of something clenched in his trembling hand. But it wasn't just his body that had changed. It was the energy. The fire was gone. The charisma was flickering like a dying bulb. "You made it," Elvis said with a weak smile. "Wasn't sure you'd come." Boone sat beside him, unsure what to say. There was a moment of silence. No handlers, no cameras, just two men who had once run the same race, now staring at each other across the finish line. "Do you think God's still watching me?" Elvis asked. Boone was stunned. The question wasn't sarcastic. It was desperate. "Always," Boone replied. "Even when we're running the wrong way." Elvis chuckled, but it ended in a cough. He leaned back in the chair, eyes closed. "Sometimes I think I'm past saving," he muttered. Boone tried to encourage him, to remind him of the hymns they grew up singing, the faith that never truly leaves us. But Elvis didn't answer. He just nodded, then whispered, "I'm so tired, Pat." It wasn't about the tour. It was about everything. The fame, the expectations, the emptiness. Boone watched as a man who once lit up the world with a single note now sat in a room too dim for joy. That was the last time they spoke. A few months later, Boone heard the news like everyone else. Elvis Presley, dead at 42. Official cause, heart failure. Unofficially, a slow-motion collapse that nobody had stopped. Boone sat alone that night, playing How Great Thou Art on an old record player, tears streaming down his face. Because what he saw that night in Vegas wasn't just the end of a career, it was the quiet collapse of a soul. And he knew, deep down, that the promise he'd made years earlier now had to be kept, that no one else would tell this part, that no one else could. Pat Boone is 91 years old. He has lived a life most people only dream of. Multi-platinum records, movie roles, best-selling books, 4 daughters, and nearly 7 decades of marriage to the love of his life. He has sung to presidents, prayed with prisoners, and performed on every major stage in the world. And yet, the story he never told, the one he carried like a stone in his chest, was about Elvis Presley. For decades, Boone buried the truth, not because he wanted to protect Elvis's image, but because he didn't think anyone would believe what he saw, what he felt, what he failed to do. He watched a friend spiral in slow motion, watched the world cheer him on while he crumbled, and stood on the sidelines, too afraid to speak up. We all saw it, Boone said in a 2025 interview. But we let it happen, and I include myself in that. So why now? Why speak after all these years? Boone says it's not about guilt or fame. It's about legacy. The world remembers Elvis for the music, the moves, the madness. But they forgot the man, he says. He was kind. He was funny. He was hungry for something real. Boone believes the myth of Elvis has outgrown the man himself, and that the real tragedy isn't how he died, but how he was forgotten while still alive. People turned him into a monument, Boone says, but he was a soul, a lost one, like any of us. In telling the truth now, Boone says he's honoring that soul, the pact they made in private, the conversation in that Vegas dressing room, the journal entries never meant to be read. It's all coming out, because Boone knows his own time is running short. I don't want to leave this world carrying a lie, he says. I want to leave it with light. In recent months, Boone has begun speaking more openly at faith conferences, college campuses, even small music workshops, not about his hits or his Hollywood days, but about Elvis, about what it means to watch someone drown in adoration and still feel unloved. He tells young artists, fame doesn't fill you, it feeds on you. And when he talks about Elvis, it's not with judgment, but grief. I wish I'd said something sooner, he tells them. I wish I'd pulled him aside and made him hear me. He pauses. But I was scared I'd lose him if I did. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. That sometimes, the silence we keep out of fear becomes the regret we can't outrun. Boone has no illusions about changing history. Elvis is gone. The world moved on. But he hopes that in telling this story now, he can offer something that was missing back then. Honesty. Not for headlines, not for attention, but for healing. His final words in that 2025 interview were not rehearsed. They weren't dramatic, just soft, quiet. He was my friend, Boone said, and I think he died believing no one really knew him. Maybe now, maybe someone will.